Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive deep into Blessed are the poor in spirit. Um, this phrase from the Sermon on the Mount, it's one of those things that's kind of puzzled people forever. Like, what does it actually mean?
Right.
And why should we even care?
Oh, yeah, it can definitely throw you off, especially at first glance. You'd think, right, that Jesus would be all about, like, self-confidence and achieving your goals, but blessed are the poor in spirit. That just sounds, well, kind of backwards.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost as if he's saying the opposite of what we expect.
Yeah.
So, I guess let's start with the basics. What does blessed even mean here? It's not just like being happy, right?
Right, it's way more than just a good feeling. In the original Greek, blessed actually means, like, receiving God's full approval and favor. It's about being in a right relationship with him, which, is where real lasting joy actually comes from.
So it's more of a state of being rather than just a fleeting feeling.
Precisely. And that takes us to the second part of the phrase, poor in spirit. And this is where, I think we need to clear up a few misconceptions.
Oh, for sure. I heard people say it means like you got to be materially poor or have low self-esteem. But honestly, that doesn't seem to fit with, what Jesus taught at all.
You're right on the money there. It's not about, like, a lack of money or putting yourself down. In Luke chapter 6, verse 20, Jesus actually makes a clear distinction between those who are physically poor and those who are, poor in spirit. This points to something way deeper.
Okay, so if it's not about material stuff or, self-esteem, then what does poor in spirit actually mean?
Well, think of it this way. Poor in spirit is kind of like admitting you're spiritually bankrupt. Like, you've got nothing to offer to God on your own merit, no good deeds, no fancy prayers, nothing to earn his favor. It's that moment when you really realize, that you are totally dependent on God's grace. Kind of like how a beggar depends on the kindness of, strangers.
Wow, that really paints a picture. It's easy to forget, how much we try to rely on our own strength and forget about how much we need God.
Totally. And, Jesus actually tells a story that illustrates this perfectly. It's in Luke 18, and it's about a Pharisee, a super religious guy, and then a tax collector, someone everyone looked down on. The Pharisee goes on and on about all the good things he's done, while the tax collector just, like, beats his chest and says, God have mercy on me, a sinner.
So the Pharisee, he was missing the point completely. He thought he was righteous, but he was actually far from God.
Right. He wasn't poor in spirit at all. He was relying on his own efforts instead of God's grace. And that's the danger of, well, clinging to human traditions and rules. It's easy to forget that true righteousness, well, it comes from God alone.
It's a good reminder to check our own hearts, for sure.
Yeah.
So how does this poverty of spirit connect to, becoming a follower of Christ?
Oh, it's foundational. You see, blessed are the poor in spirit is the very first of the beatitudes, the blessings that Jesus gives, the start of the Sermon on the Mount. It's like the entry point into his kingdom.
So are you saying that unless we come to God with that sense of like humility and need, we can't really experience his blessing?
That's it. We got to let go of our pride and our self-sufficiency and just acknowledge that we're completely dependent on him. It's about realizing that, well, apart from Christ, we're spiritually lost. And that's a truth that a lot of traditions and religious practices tend to, well, kind of obscure.
Wow, that's profound. It's almost like we have to empty ourselves so that God can, fill us with his grace.
You got it. Remember that Jesus said, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. It's not about what we do for God, but what he has already done for us through Christ.
It's a total paradigm shift.
Absolutely. And it challenges us to, rethink everything we thought we knew about success and happiness. It's all about lining our hearts with God's will, not with, the ways of the world.
Blessed are the poor in spirit. It's such a simple statement, yet so profound. And, it's challenging, but it's also liberating.
I'm starting to get why this is so central to the Christian faith.
It really is at the core of what it means to, follow Christ. And it's a journey of continual surrender where we let go of our own desires and embrace his perfect will for our lives.
This is really making me think, how can we as listeners cultivate this poverty of spirit? Is it something we can just, choose to do?
That's a great question. And the answer might surprise you. It's not about trying harder or forcing ourselves to feel a certain way. It's about, shifting our focus.
Okay, so not about self-effort.
Exactly. It's about, looking at God. The more we understand his holiness and perfection, the more we realize our own need.
So less introspection and more about looking outward toward God. You're getting it. Picture this. Imagine standing next to a really, really bright light. What happens? Well, that light reveals every little imperfection, every flaw. And that's what happens when we truly encounter God. His light, it exposes our insufficiency. But here's the beautiful part. That same light, the one that reveals everything, well, it also offers warmth and healing. God's grace. It covers our imperfections. And his love, well, it fills our emptiness.
That's a powerful image. It makes me think of how John Wesley describes sin as this, like, loathsome leprosy. When we truly see ourselves before God as we are, that's when we feel that, like, utter poverty of spirit, that desperate need for, his cleansing touch.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of blessed are the poor in spirit. It's not about feeling sorry for ourselves or getting stuck in despair. It's about like running to the one who can actually heal us and restore us. It's realizing that true fulfillment, well, it's not found in ourselves, but in him.
So how do we even know, if we're really embracing this poverty of spirit? Like, what are some signs we can look for in our own lives?
Well, one of the most obvious signs, I think, is when we become less focused on ourselves. We're not so caught up in our own needs and desires. Instead, we're more interested in like God's will, his glory.
So it's less about me, and more about, like, genuinely loving God and wanting to please him.
Exactly. And that love, well, it shows up in our actions, right? We start to see this genuine desire to be more like Christ. There's this hunger for righteousness, a yearning to, reflect his character in everything we do and say.
Almost like we're looking through a new lens.
Yeah.
Everything just seems different. Our priorities change, our values, everything shifts.
Absolutely. And with that shift comes a deeper humility. We're more willing to admit when we're wrong, to ask for help, to, let go of that need to always be right.
So being teachable,
Hmm.
recognizing that we don't have all the answers, and, like, being open to learning from others.
Right. And that openness, well, it leads to a more genuine prayer life, too. We're not just like going through the motions or rattling off a list of wants, but truly seeking God's presence, acknowledging his sovereignty, and, really pouring our hearts out to him.
It becomes less of a, I don't know, monologue and more like a real conversation with God, a relationship of deep dependence and trust.
You got it. And as that relationship grows, we become even more aware of our own spiritual poverty, our constant need for his grace. It's not a one-time thing, but like a daily surrender.
Almost like a waterfall, right? This continuous flow of God's grace pouring into our lives. And we need that cleansing and renewal every step of the way.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it really highlights how important it is to rely on God's word as our guide, not on, fleeting human traditions or interpretations. The Bible is clear. We're saved by grace, not by our own efforts.
Blessed are the poor in spirit. It's not just a suggestion. It's a core truth, like a foundation for our whole relationship with God.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's the starting point for everything else Jesus teaches. Without that foundation of humility and dependence, well, we'll just keep trying to build our own kingdoms instead of surrendering to his.
So how does this poverty of spirit actually show up in our daily lives? Like,
Yeah.
what are some practical ways we can live this out?
It starts with recognizing that, well, everything we have is a gift from God. Our talents, our possessions, even our very breath, it all belongs to him.
So it's about being good stewards of everything God has entrusted to us.
Exactly. And that stewardship involves generosity.
Yeah.
We're not so focused on like hoarding wealth for ourselves, but we become more interested in sharing what we have with others, especially, those in need.
We become like channels for God's blessings, right?
Yeah.
Pouring out his love and provision to everyone around us.
That's it. It's a powerful antidote to, well, all the greed and materialism in our culture.
Yeah, it's almost like a radical countercultural way of life, isn't it?
Absolutely. It goes against everything the world tells us about success and happiness. But the paradox is that true joy and fulfillment, they're not found in chasing our own selfish ambitions. They're found in surrendering to God's will.
It's a beautiful inversion. The way up is down. The way to gain is to lose.
You said it. And that's the heart of the gospel, right? It's about dying to self and living for Christ, embracing the humility of like a child and trusting in our Father's loving care.
This is really challenging me to think about my own priorities, and how I view myself before God.
That's what blessed are the poor in spirit does. It shakes us out of our complacency, strips away all the pretense, and reveals our desperate need for God.
So, as we keep going with this deep dive, I'm curious, how does this poverty of spirit affect, like, our relationships with other people?
That's a fantastic question. When we recognize our own, brokenness and our need for grace, We become so much more understanding and compassionate toward others.
So it makes us less judgmental, more forgiving.
Exactly. It helps us see past people's flaws and recognize the image of God in them, even when they're, hard to love.
It's like we're taking off those rose-colored glasses that make us think we're, better than everyone else. We realize, hey, we're all sinners in need of God's grace.
Right. And that realization, well, it leads to humility and empathy. We're less likely to hold grudges, to gossip, to, tear others down, because we understand our own need for forgiveness and grace.
So this poverty of spirit, it really spills over into every part of our lives, huh? Changes how we see the world, how we interact with people.
It's a complete transformation, changes our hearts, our minds, our actions, everything.
As we're talking, I keep thinking about how countercultural this whole concept is. Our world, it celebrates self-promotion and achievement.
It's true. Everywhere we look, there are messages telling us to be the best, to climb the ladder, to, make a name for yourself. But Jesus calls us to a different path, a path of humility and surrender.
It's like a complete 180 from the world's way of thinking.
Absolutely. Blessed are the poor in spirit. It challenges everything our culture values, but it's in that challenge, that we find true freedom and lasting joy.
So how do we, navigate this tension between the world's values and, this call to poverty of spirit? How do we live out this beatitude when everything around us seems to, push against it?
That's a great question, and it's one we're going to explore as we continue our deep dive into blessed are the poor in spirit.
It's tough, like swimming upstream. Everything around us screams, get more, be better, faster, stronger. But then Jesus comes along and says, nope, true blessedness comes from knowing you need me. Talk about a mind bender.
It really is taking that step out of the current,
Yeah.
resisting how the world thinks. But the promise that comes with blessed are the poor in spirit, well, that makes it a little easier.
Oh, right. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's huge. But what's it actually mean? It's not just like floating on clouds after we die, is it?
You got it. The kingdom of heaven, it's not some far-off place. It's God's reign right here, right now. His rule, his authority. It's aligning our hearts with what he wants, his values, all of it.
So it's happening now, but also something we look forward to in the future.
Exactly. When we get this poor in spirit thing, we start to experience God's kingdom, little tastes of it, his peace, his joy, his love. It becomes real. And then, well, we just want more. We long for the fullness of his kingdom later.
Like seeing a beautiful view through a window, right?
Right.
And it makes you want to burst out the door and experience the whole thing.
I love that. That's what blessed are the poor in spirit is all about. It's not just rules or some stuffy theology. It's an invitation to a real, exciting, life-changing relationship with God.
So back to everyday life. How do we actually live this out? Especially with all the pressure to, achieve and climb the ladder and all that.
Well, one thing we can do is practice being thankful. Instead of focusing on what we don't have, we thank God for what we do. It's amazing how that shifts our perspective. It makes us realize, hey, I really do depend on him.
So like making a list of good things, big or small, and remembering they're all from God.
Yep. And it's also about being content with what we have. Not in a lazy way, but knowing that true fulfillment, well, it doesn't come from stuff or achievements, but from knowing God and following his will.
Finding our identity, our security in him,
Yeah.
not in what we own or accomplish.
Exactly. And when that happens, we become more generous. Our time, our talents, everything. We're not trying to build our own little empires anymore. We're focused on God's kingdom.
Makes me think of the early church in Acts. They shared everything, took care of each other, spread the gospel like crazy, and they were joyful doing it. That's poor in spirit in action, right?
Such a great example. They knew true wealth wasn't about possessions. It was about their relationship with God and being part of his mission.
So blessed are the poor in spirit. It's not just a nice saying, huh? It's a call to action, a challenge to live differently in a world that's all about, I got this, and look at all my stuff.
Absolutely. It's a journey, one that takes constant surrender, humility, relying on God's grace. We're going to mess up, but God's love never fails, and he's always there to pick us back up.
It's good to know we're not in this alone, huh? God's Spirit helps us live this out, even when it feels, well, impossible or like we're going against the grain.
So true. And as we rely on his grace, we realize blessed are the poor in spirit. It's more than words. It's the doorway to a life of freedom, joy, real purpose.
So wrapping up our deep dive here, I want to leave everyone with a little challenge. What does blessed are the poor in spirit look like in your life right now?
Where do you need to let go of pride, of thinking you can do it all on your own? How is God asking you to trust him more, depend on him? Think about those things and ask God to show you where you need to, surrender to him.
And remember, you're not alone. God's grace is more than enough. His Spirit will guide you. His love will be there every step of the way. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Blessed are the poor in spirit.